Well, hello everybody. My name's Stephen Evans. I'm the Chief Executive of the Learning and Work Institute, and it's great to welcome, I think, just over 200 of you signed up to today's event, which is on a really important topic about how we can reduce economic inactivity. So we've got a really weird labour market at the moment, with employers hiring at record levels and struggling to fill all of their vacancies, and yet employment's still below pre-pandemic levels. And the reason those two things coexist is because economic inactivity has risen. So governments recognise this, it's having a look at this, and the event today is going to look at what we can do about it, what we think the action should be for the government and also for others to tackle it. We've got an amazing lineup of speakers, so looking forward to hearing from them as well as from all of you as well. And chairing today's discussion is Akila Ahmed, who is an equalities campaigner, founded She Speaks, We Hear in 2014 and works with the government, advising them on tackling anti-Muslim hatred, and is also a social entrepreneur within the social housing sector. So Akila, thank you for chairing today's discussion. And without further ado, I'll hand straight over to you.
Thank you so much, Stephen, and thank you so much to the Learning and Work Institute for putting on this really important event. So as Stephen mentioned, the latest labour market figures show that 9 million people, that's 21.6% of the working age population, are economically inactive. And this is up by about 500,000 since the pandemic. This group now mostly comprises of the over 50s, people with caring responsibilities, people with long-term health conditions or disabilities, and students. Refugees and some ethnic minority groups are also overrepresented as people who are economically inactive. Now, the Learning and Work Institute has published several reports on these issues, and one of their reports shows that the UK is an international outlier when it comes to the gaps in employment, and the UK sees the biggest drops in over 50s in the workforce compared to 10 major other countries that were studied. And the UK has now seen the largest fall in employment in the G7 since the pandemic started. Some of these economically inactive people, 1.64 million, say they want a job. Increasing levels of economic inactivity and labour shortages have prompted a DWP-led review of economic inactivity, which will report in early 2023. It's clear that employers and government need to find ways to support people back into the labour market, growing supply rather than putting the brakes on a smaller, overheated economy. This webinar will hopefully give us an opportunity to reflect on some of the groups most likely to be economically inactive, why that is, and what we want to see from the review. So we welcome an esteemed panel of speakers to discuss what is known about people who are economically inactive, what is needed to help workforce participation, and the future of employment support. We are honoured to be joined by Naomi Clayton, who is Deputy Director of the Learning and Work Institute, Catherine Foote, who is a Director at Phoenix Insights, David Finch, who's Assistant Director of the Health Foundation, and Richard Rigby, Head of Policy and Public Affairs at the Francis Trust. Before I hand over to Naomi, just to say that the event is being recorded and will be made available on YouTube for people to watch back. There will be a Q&A after the panelist presentations, and the questions are being gathered on Slido. So if I may, I'd really like to hand over to Naomi, who, as I mentioned, is Deputy Director at the Learning and Work Institute, and who's going to provide an overview of what we know about economic inactivity and the latest data trends. Over to you, Naomi.
Great, thank you, Akila. Yes, I'm going to do a bit of scene setting, so talk about what's happening in the UK labour market, how it compares to other countries, and just finish by outlining some of the things we think we can do to address some of those challenges. So if we can go on to my second slide. So, you know, the UK kind of started with a relatively high employment rate and saw a relatively shallow drop in employment during the first 6 months of the pandemic, in part because of the furlough scheme and the way in which that scheme helped protect millions of jobs. But from 2021 onwards, the UK's employment rate performance has been less impressive, particularly compared to other countries in the G7. So this chart here shows you employment rate changes from the start of the pandemic to the first quarter of 2022, and shows the kind of change across the G7 countries. And we can see that the UK is right on the right-hand side of this chart. The UK and US are the only G7 countries where employment rates remain below pre-pandemic levels, and the UK has seen the biggest fall in the employment rate. If the UK was to match Australia, which is over on the left-hand side of this chart, an extra 1 million people would be in work. But actually, in the UK, if we go to the next slide, we've seen the sharpest drop in economic activity rates since the start of the pandemic, compared to our comparator countries. So we know that economic activity rates are now higher in a lot of other countries like Germany, Canada, Australia. But we've seen a sharp fall in the UK. And this has resulted in what we call the missing million. So our analysis suggests that the number of people who are economically active is around 1 million lower than if pre-pandemic trends had continued. And this is essentially what this chart is showing you. And around 2/3 of this is due to a rise in economic inactivity. So people dropping out of the labour market. Around 1/3 of it is due to slower population growth. And of course, this has implications for individuals. It has implications for the businesses that are struggling to recruit, and implications for our economy as a whole. So if we just look at quickly what's happening with economic inactivity and change since the start of the pandemic on the next slide, we can see that essentially this is looking at change in economic inactivity by the reasons given, main reasons given since the start of the pandemic. And early on in the pandemic, inactivity rose as people essentially stopped looking for work due to the pandemic. There being kind of reduced work opportunities due to lockdowns. That's the burgundy kind of colour on this chart. And more young people were staying in education, which is in orange. But from mid 2021, we actually saw a substantial rise in the number of people who were long-term sick. So that's this kind of green, kind of teal colour on the chart, and a smaller rise in the number of people who say that they've retired, so in yellow here. The latest data shows that there's been around a 21% increase in the number of people who are economically inactive due to long-term sickness. So there's been significant rise there. And a number of factors will contribute to this, and not least the NHS waiting lists, potentially kind of long COVID, but also the kind of rising prevalence and awareness of mental health conditions. So we've seen a 15% increase in the number of people who are economically inactive with mental health conditions over the last 2.5 years. We've also seen older people leaving the workforce. If we go to the next slide. So we've seen a 10.5% increase in men and women aged 50 to 64 who are economically inactive. So that's the top line on this chart that just shows you the changes in in people who are economically inactive by age since the start of the pandemic. And there are up to nearly 3.6 million older people in their 50s and 60s who have dropped out of the labour market, and there's likely to be some overlap there with those citing long-term sickness and early retirement as their reasons for economically inactive. But essentially it means that there are over 700,000 fewer over 50s in the labour market since the pandemic started. And crucially, the UK is the only country that we've looked at amongst those comparator countries that's seen a significant fall in economic activity rates for people in their 50s and 60s. And actually in other countries, you've seen rates back at pre-pandemic levels, and actually rises in some other countries. But of course, the picture doesn't look the same everywhere. If we just go to the next slide, the kind of trends that we've seen at the UK level aren't always matched across the UK, and we've seen a handful of regions bucking those broader trends. So in some regions like the Northeast, we've seen an increase in employment. In the West Midlands, we've seen increases in unemployment, and in Yorkshire, we've seen a fall in economic inactivity. But there's a lot of yellow on this chart, which shows you the rises in economic inactivity across regions in the UK, and we've seen some of the sharpest increases in places like the East Midlands and North West. Very conscious of time, so if we just quickly go to the next slide, which just shows you a map of inactivity due to long-term sickness, and there are very clear spatial divides when we look at the proportion of people who are out of the labour market due to long-term sickness. This map here shows the darker areas are where rates are higher, and in parts of the Merseyside or the Liverpool City region, 1 in 7 people are out of the labour market because they are long-term sick, compared to just 1 in 100 in parts of Surrey. So really big spatial disparities there. And of course, if we're to address the kind of current labour shortages, we need to do something about the recent rises in economic inactivity, but also the kind of longer term gaps in employment. If we go to the next slide, just illustrates those gaps. So if we were to close the gap between the lowest employment, the 20% of areas with the lowest employment rates and the rest of the country, there would be over 500,000 more people in work. One of the biggest gaps is obviously the disability employment gap. If we were to close that gap, it would mean 2.4 million people in work. So we need to really look at how we can address some of those longer term gaps in the employment rate across different groups too. And just to lastly touch on what we can do about this. I think it's partly about extending employment support. So at the moment, just 1 in 10 out of work disabled people or older people will be getting employment support. And we need to look at kind of multiple routes to engage people in that support. We could fund this partly through the underspend from the Plan for Jobs programme, and by bringing forward parts of the Shared Prosperity Fund. We obviously need to join up work, health and employer support, and clearly there's a clear role for employers in terms of attracting people into jobs and keeping them in work too. So I will finish there and hand back to Akila to make sure that the other speakers have got plenty of time and we've got plenty of time for discussion.
Thank you so much, Naomi. That was really insightful. I'd now like to hand over to Catherine Foote. Catherine is the director of Phoenix Insights, and Catherine is going to share with us some reflections on why people over the age of 50 are leaving the labour market and how can they be supported back into work. Over to you, Catherine.
Thank you so much, Akila. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. For those that don't know me, Phoenix Insights is a really relatively new think tank supporting the government's business champion for older workers, Andy Briggs, at his company, Phoenix Group, which is one of the UK's biggest pensions companies. So I do research and analysis all around how to support more people to set themselves up to be in a financially secure position when they reach retirement. And so this issue of economic inactivity and the sudden shift in the exodus of people in their 50s and 60s from the labour market post-COVID is a really, really critical issue. We're down, pretty much 500,000, as Naomi was talking about, on pre-pandemic trends that we might have expected for participation in work in this age group. So it's a really extraordinary and sudden shift. And if we're to ask ourselves why, I think clearly, and I know that David is going to talk a bit more about this, long-term health is an important factor, perhaps not a reason specifically for many in large numbers in this group to immediately leave the workforce post-COVID, but clearly a blocker for them coming back. So really significant issues with long-term health conditions and a role, I think, critically for employers to do more here. But I'll come on to what I think we can do about these issues. I think what's also important for this group is that there's a proportion here of people who've taken essentially early retirement, if you like, because they feel they can afford it. So in this country, people in their 50s and 60s who are newly economically inactive post-pandemic, much more likely to own their own homes outright or have very low housing costs, much more likely to feel they have good defined benefit pensions. And so I think there's a really interesting question around, are we helping that age group judge accurately whether or not their assessment that they can afford to stop working is actually going to pan out? Every day I feel there's a story in the paper, some survey or other revealing this phenomenon that sometimes gets called the great unretirement. Is this group beginning to come back, and is the cost of living crisis driving them back? Maybe for some, in some cases, that is already starting to happen. A sad and difficult reason, of course, rather than a positive reason to rejoin the labour market. But I think at the moment, seeing such small numbers here, I don't think we can rest on our laurels that rising mortgage prices and cost of living will drive this group successfully back to work, because we know that this group faces huge systemic structural barriers in access to returning to work. Ageism in the workplace, age discrimination in recruitment, that will not make this an easy task. We did some work at Phoenix Insights speaking to this age group. We did some surveys in this country and in some others, and I've actually spent all week in the evenings this week in some focus groups with people in their 50s and 60s, talking to them about what the pandemic did for them in terms of their attitudes to work and retirement, what decisions they've made, how they've been thinking about it, how they've been talking about it with their families. And I think what's really struck me is a significant shift in priorities for some people that has been driven by the pandemic. Our survey data suggested that people in the UK in this age group have been much more deeply affected by their experience of the pandemic than people in their 50s and 60s in other countries. Some of the people I was speaking to this week, one woman said, well, I got a taste for retirement in lockdown, and I really rather liked it. Another, though, describing real sense of regret for not having really thought through what retirement would be like. He said something, this was just last night, said something like, for me, retirement feels like a rut. And what's a rut? It's a shallow grave. he was feeling isolated and concerned that his potentially 10, 20, 30 years ahead was not quite the life that he thought it would be. So I think there's something really interesting that we need to explore much more deeply about, attitudinal shifts post-pandemic to work in this age group and for others too. So you also asked me to think about what do we do about it. So first and foremost, I would say I really do think there does need to be significant effort in supporting this age group to understand their finances. So few people take up their free pension-wise appointments. So few people can afford, of course, independent financial advice. That's incredibly expensive. But we need to find ways of supporting people to make this judgment for themselves on the basis of really good information and guidance. I think I totally agree with Naomi. I think there's going to be lots of violent agreement on the session today, I suspect, about how to solve some of these issues, but totally agree with Naomi that we've got to shift careers and employment support to reach this group in a way that current services so often fail to do. We've got to reach them where they are with support that's targeted, that's holistic, give them access and eligibility to the sorts of programs that we know work. And I think then I'd also point to a huge role for employers. Phoenix Group, where I work, is one of the founder members of the new Centre for Ageing Better's age-friendly employer pledge, where employers are sort of standing up and committing to recognising the huge importance of this potential talent pool of older workers, but how the working environments need to reflect what they need to make work for them. And in that, front and centre, I would put flexible working, I would put support for people with long-term health conditions, I would put really good policies in place for carers. And finally, I think there's an agenda here to think about in terms of skills and retraining. We know that trends in adult education and access to lifelong learning and retraining and reskilling declines as you age. Employer investment in retraining has been on a steady decline. And actually, if we're going to get some of this age group back into work, we need to find much better routes to make retraining and reskilling and career switching viable, practical and affordable opportunities for them. Thanks very much. I'll leave it there for now. Akila, back to you.
Thank you so much, Catherine. And I will hand straight over to David Finch, who is Assistant Director at Health Foundation. And David is going to share with us his reflections on the links between poor health and economic activity and how people can be supported into work or to remain in work. Over to you, David.
Sure, and thank you. And thank you for the invitation to speak today. And I'd also just say that the Health Foundation, so I'm from the Health Foundation, and we're a charity aiming to improve health and reduce inequalities in health. And we're particularly focused on doing this through through what we call the determinants of health. So all of our day-to-day experiences and the conditions we live in that are such big influences on our health. I was going to give a bit of context and try not to repeat some of the stats and things that have come out already, and then also talk a bit about why this matters and what can be done about it. So, I mean, as has been said, there's been this kind of quite large rise in economically inactive people, and around half of that has been due to people, around half of that increase is among people reporting poor health as their main reason for being economically inactive. And I think, as Catherine was saying, there are a number of reasons behind that rise in inactivity. And I think when we then look at the rise of people reporting poor health for being inactive, there are also a number of causes for that rise in poor health. So it's not I think it's not a really simple picture. It's quite complicated, which also then speaks to some of the solutions needing to be probably various and also quite tailored, which I'll get into at the end. I think there has obviously been a focus on this rise post-pandemic, and we think to some extent long COVID and waiting lists or increased waiting lists for healthcare treatments have played a role in that rise, but we don't think they're the main contributors, and that's partly because although this rise has become more apparent since the start of the pandemic, it actually follows a longer term trend that was gradually rising even pre-pandemic. There are around 2.5 million people now economically inactive and reporting poor health as their main reason. And that had been gradually rising in the period before, and some of the increase we're seeing is actually just people who have already had poor health for a period of time and been inactive still being inactive. So there's so it's not all just kind of new flows of people suddenly in poor health and not being able to work anymore. And I think a further complication here is that often people report different reasons. Either it appears that as people are reporting one reason when they start to become inactive, and then that view may change, which I think Catherine was talking a bit about. And also people report additional reasons for being inactive, such as caring or early retirement. So so it is a bit of a complicated picture, but we think overall, when we look longer term, there's definitely been this kind of growing and sustained trend for people who are economically inactive and reporting poor health as the main reason for being so. And we think there's also a concern when we look at some of the inequalities involved here, where I think Naomi was showing the geographic patterns of this, and those do tend to broadly reflect, perhaps as we'd expect, areas that already have kind of poor underlying health, and not just poor health due to economic inactivity. But it's very much a kind of, this trend continues, and we see further or higher rates of economic inactivity in those areas, then potentially it's going to exacerbate those kind of quite long-standing geographic inequalities in health. So why does this matter? I think it matters particularly for the individual for a number of reasons. Unemployment is really one of the key determinants of health. There are really strong links between health and employment, and both tend to influence each other. But that means for the individual, there's a potential sort of negative for health of not being in work, because being in work tends to be good for health. That's partly through the structure that being in work can bring, opportunities to socialise and sense of status. But it's also the key way in which people obtain income, and which in itself is really important to achieve kind of adequate standard of living, and which is a good thing for health. And then on the flip side of that, not having work is bad for health, and can have and there's a kind of longer term potential risk here, particularly where we've seen there is some increase in economic inactivity and poor health among younger age groups. That could have a potential knock-on effect over the long term, both on their employment chances, but also their health chances. So what can be done about this? So I think it's not straightforward, because there is no kind of single solution to this, and the reasons for people being inactive and their health conditions can vary quite significantly. I think the two kind of main areas of focus are, think about retention of staff, so that's doing more to help support people stay in employment. But going off sick and making sure they come back to work and retain roles. And there, I think there's a really important role for employers, and also which, as Catherine was mentioning before, and some of that's about keeping in touch with staff and off sick. And I think there is signs that the pandemic has really increased businesses' awareness of the importance for health. We recently supported an employer health index, which was launched at the CBI conference. So I think there's actually appetite to do something of this, and recognition of the issue, which I think would be a really important part of the government's participation review, to recognise that role of business and do more with them. And then the other area is activation, which I think everyone's talked about so far. But I think here, my one thing that I would really like to see is recognition of the scale of that challenge. I don't think it's as simple as just diverting resources towards the poor health and economically inactive group. We've historically not been very good at getting that group into work. It really requires tailored support. So I think actually one thing that would be really important for the review to recognise is the need to spend more time developing, investing in better support for that group of people, to support them into work over the long term.
Thank you so much, David. I'd now like to hand over to Richard Rigby, who is the Head of Policy and Public Affairs at the Prince's Trust, and he's going to speak to us about young people who are economically inactive and how they can be supported into work. Over to you, Richard.
Thanks, Akila. Pleased to be here. I'm just going to I'm going to skip my intro and just dive straight into the second slide. Perfect. So just to begin and look at who are the economically inactive young people that we have. So there are about 2.7 million economically inactive young people, but as you will see, so in this chart, you can see that the majority of them are in full-time education. There are, however, almost 640,000 economically inactive young people who are not in full-time education. Now, if we want to talk about those who are in full-time education, perhaps we can get into that in the discussion, but for the purpose of this presentation, I'm going to focus on those who are NEET young people, and so not in full-time education and economically inactive, because that's where at the Prince's Trust we see more impetus to focus at the moment. And then moving on, we've got, so this chart shows how the NEET group has changed over time. And thanks to Learning and Work for this research that we did with them in the summer. I'd say let's ignore the top yellow line for the minute, that's the unemployed. Let's focus just on the three other lines, which are economic inactivity, and the three groups we have there. The orange line, inactive due to looking after the family, has been on a steady decline pretty much over the last decade. So significantly fewer young people inactive due to looking after family or other caring responsibilities. However, both of the other two groups, those who are inactive for health reasons, inactive for other reasons, that includes discouraged worker, which Naomi mentioned earlier, have been on the rise. The next slide just breaks this down slightly by gender, so you can see just briefly how the decline in inactive due to family responsibilities has predominantly been amongst females. There's barely any change. It's not common amongst males to be inactive due to caring responsibilities. So the big decline there is due to females being inactive for that reason. Both genders, you see an increase in inactivity due to health reasons, but there are more men young men inactive due to health. One thing on moving on is that's worth pointing out is the association between inactivity and qualification level. So on the left here, you've got the highest level of qualification for each individual. And then the bars you can see there are the various reasons for inactivity. Now you'll notice that there's barely any association between qualification level and likelihood of being unemployed at age 21 to 24. However, there's huge association between having a lower qualification, your highest qualification, and therefore being inactive. That's association rather than causality, but it's worth bearing in mind. Coming back to health, which we've just seen has been the reason for activity which has been rising most amongst young people, we can look at what the particular health aspects for which young people are inactive. And what this shows here is that depression, anxiety, and mental illness is by far and away the most significant. There are a few other, I think about roughly a quarter, you could say, due to physical disability, but alongside depression, anxiety, and mental illness, you've also got learning difficulties and autism there. This was reinforced by polling we did in the summer, which this was polling NEET young people for the main reason they're finding it difficult to find a job or not currently looking for work. And as you can see here, mental health problems and disability came out far away in the lead amongst a host of other options that they had there. So what's the scale of the opportunity? We have, as I think one of the speakers mentioned earlier, you can look at to what extent inactive groups want to work or don't want to work. And young people amongst these three inactive groups, between about a quarter and a third of them would like to work. So there is an opportunity there. You can see that amongst a similar proportion amongst those who have caring responsibilities, sick or disabled, or inactive for other reasons. So we think there's a real opportunity to help these people into work. And then in terms of what could help, this was, we asked a similar question for those groups, and by far and away the most popular was help to build my confidence, which is interesting. I would say looking down the reasons that we looked at here, it's not the typical list of reasons that you might think our welfare to work system is normally very capable of. So, for example, opportunity to gain work experience in place number 2, that is something that is very familiar amongst young people in Job Centre Plus, but the rest not so much. Moving on, the next slide shows that the less popular, and quite a few of these I think you could see would be popular options in Job Centre Plus, for example, opportunity to practice jobs applications and interview techniques. Next slide, please. We also looked at what the most important considerations when choosing jobs to apply for, and flexibility and location. For this group in particular, increasingly important. And I'll just finish briefly with, we have a few recommendations for the review, which I won't go into now due to time, but I'll be interested to hear any feedback from those who work in local authorities on point 1, or anyone familiarity with Job Centre Plus on point 2 and 3. But yeah, I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Richard. If I could now ask all speakers to turn on their video, please, and we will move to the question and answer session. We've already got some questions that have come in. The first question we have is, how effective is social prescribing in bridging the gap between health and work and guiding people towards employment they seek? If I could ask all speakers to respond, but if I could start with David, please. Thank you.
Sure. Well, I think health services can play a really important part in helping to point people with existing health conditions towards support with employment, and also in helping to, I suppose, ultimately maintain people's health if they are sick and off work. But I do think it ultimately, we shouldn't be relying on the health service to keep helping to keep people healthy in the first place. It's almost an admission of failure if we expect that the NHS should have to pick up that acute need when it could be tackled far earlier through kind of broader employment services.
Thanks, David. Richard, what are your thoughts?
Not too much to add. I think there's so much we can do, on to David's point, in terms of helping, rather than when you reach the acute mental health problems, there's so much we can do to help people build their confidence, self-esteem and efficacy before it gets to that point, which I think is what the extent of what you're saying there, David.
Thank you. And Catherine or Naomi, do you have anything you'd like to say? Catherine?
Just briefly to endorse what David said. I think sometimes when people seeking all sorts of improvements on behalf of working age people jump to GPs, because that's a place we know that grown-ups go on a regular basis. It's a place to reach people, but actually, of course, there are all sorts of specialist services that I think could be much better supported and expanded and enabled to reach people with this kind of employment support. That said, I think all power to social prescribing and its efforts to enable GPs to understand that sort of matrix of local services that they can signpost people to. But I don't think it's the answer here.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I think I agree with what's been said. But I think we need to look at a variety of ways in which we can join up kind of work and health. And one of the suggestions that we've put forward is potentially refocusing some of the work coaches in Job Centre Plus, for instance, on kind of trying to better align work and health services.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. So we've got another question that has come in. Does the geographic mix of long-term sickness reflect types of jobs in those areas? For example, prevalence of manufacturing in Wales and the North, where sickness rate is higher. Naomi, would you like to respond to that first?
I think David spoke to this a bit too, but I think the map that we've seen that I've kind of highlighted on kind of prevalence of people who are out of the labour market and long-term sick, in some ways kind of reflects kind of long-running spatial disparities and inequalities in this country. I think a lot of these places will be kind of more deprived, have kind of higher rates of, historically higher rates of inactivity, and there will be a kind of number of reasons why you see higher rates of kind of long-term sickness, but these are not, I think crucially, these are not kind of new spatial divides. They're really kind of long running, and I think, you know, clearly local kind of leaders and organizations have a kind of clear role to play in kind of addressing some of the challenges that we see. And so I think it's really important to look at the Shared Prosperity Fund and future devolution deals in terms of what we can do to kind of devolve and resource kind of local partnerships to better join up some of the services that we've been talking about, to support more people into work or closer to the labour market and address some of these long-running inequalities.
Thank you. Would anybody else like to add any responses?
Just when we looked at the young people data on this, there wasn't a huge variety between, you know, southwest versus northeast. It was more just following deprivation, areas of deprivation, that if you were to look at IMD, that would be a much better predictor of where economic inactivity is, rather than the sub-regions that we have.
Thank you.
I was just going to add as well. So the ONS had looked at some of the this kind of rates of long-term sick by the occupation or industry people were in previously. So it's not both the geography and the industry occupation, but it does show that there are higher rates of people coming from, or people that of economically inactive people with long-term sickness that were in more things like process, plant and machine operative roles, or elementary occupations, and also in kind of retail and some of the lower paid occupations, which I think does point to, I would expect that would also then map across in the way that Naomi was talking about. I suppose that also to some extent points towards how insecure some of those roles are, and the extent to which people will be covered by existing, whether it's statutory sick pay schemes or, and if they are covered by statutory sick pay schemes, they're probably less likely to be covered by like a fuller occupational sick pay that actually gives you like full salary replacement or close to full salary replacement. So I do think it, particularly when we're thinking about retention and helping to keep people healthy, there's potential risk there that the people who are most at risk of becoming ill and leaving work have the least protection.
Thanks very much. And we've got a question here. Are there some easy-ish policy wins on reducing economic inactivity? Who would like to respond to that question?
I'll say one. I'll offer one thing. I mean, I'm sure we've all got our ideas. I know that the current government inevitably has a sort of, 6 to 12 months timetable, doesn't it, really, to try and have some impact on this before it gets into electioneering. So quick wins is very much the question of the day, isn't it? I think one thing I would say is, to reiterate, I guess, some of what we've been talking about already, is I think we could realistically quite quickly roll out support like midlife reviews. I noticed on Slido some questions speaking to that point too. I think there are, that's one example of an initiative that's quite holistic, that enables people to think about both their money, their work, their health and well-being in the round, and reflect on what sort of support they could get locally, nationally, from all sorts of public services and others, to take their life in a new direction and make different decisions that will support them for their likely much longer lives. I think roll up midlife reviews I would probably put up there, but I'm sure others have other views about more targeted holistic employment support that I think actually could be, you just change some eligibility criteria, reinvest some of the savings from the Plan for Jobs programme, and I think you could make small inroads quite quickly. But I'd reinforce what I think David said, and what's sort of implicit in all of our conversation is that you can add this up with the macro numbers to one enormous phenomenon, but it is actually 100 different phenomena, and so there isn't one answer.
So one of the main aspects of the UK Shared Prosperity Fund is specifically to support economically inactive people into work. And we actually had some of the investment plans published last week. And in Northern Ireland, it was the #1 priority. They even set a goal around it to support 20,000 economically inactive people into work. However, in England, the government have made a decision to hold back that element of funding until 2024-25. So I'm not sure how easy the win is, but to bring that forward by a year, that would be advantageous in England.
I was just going to add, I actually think, well, Catherine's touched on this, and I think Naomi had it as well as one of the points there, where you can refocus some of the resources aimed at kind of unemployment or long-term unemployment onto this group, so that you perhaps some of the more the easier to help or support, you can start to pick those up more quickly without having to. But I do think at the same time, it's that recognition that it does need a longer term approach and develop that better to really make kind of lasting long-term inroads there. But then there's also things that are currently exist that work and people know they work, and it's got how much those can be more fully funded or extended. So I'm thinking of there's things like individual placement and support services that are starting to be, I think, rolled out a bit further. But whether those are, I suppose there's a question of whether the things that we know tend to work already, are they sufficiently funded and being sort of scaled up quickly enough?
Thank you for those responses. Oh, sorry, no,
I just
go ahead.
quickly add.
Yeah, sure.
I'd just say on kind of, I think we've kind of all suggested kind of extending employment support, widening eligibility, and I think it's really important there to work with the organisations that people are already in contact with, like housing associations. You know, they're incredibly active in the employment and skills space. I also think we've spoken a bit about the role of employers. I think there's something there around helping employers understand how they can support employees, but also making sure that employers, and particularly SMEs, are aware of the support that's already out there, like access to work. So I'd just add that too.
That's great, thank you. We've got time for one question, and Richard, if I may come to you for this question. When young people said they don't want to work, did they go into details as to why? That's the question.
So that is data is collected by the ONS. It's on the labour force survey, I think, and I've certainly not seen what the reasons they've given on that, or even if they're asked.
Okay.
I think let's say, I mean, you can make some reasonable assumptions about. So, for example, if your child, let's say you have caring responsibilities, if your child is younger, then you're more likely to say I don't want to work than if your child is slightly older, because you're more likely to be preparing to go back to the labour market.
Okay, great, thank you. And does anybody else want to add to that? We've got 1 minute before I have to sort of close the Q&A. Nope. Okay. All right, that's great, thank you. So that is the end of our Q&A, and I just want to say a huge thank you to all of our speakers. Your presentations have been incredibly insightful. Thank you so much. And as I'm sure you've seen on the Slido, there were so many questions that we could have gone on for a really long time, but unfortunately we can't. And I also just want to say a big thank you to our attendees for joining the session and for asking some really interesting questions. I'm now going to hand over to Stephen Evans, who is the Chief Executive of Learning and Work Institute, and he will give the closing remarks. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Akila. Yes, I think this is a big topic. We could probably have spoken for the next 3 weeks probably about this, but no one wants to miss Christmas. So there's lots more we could have got into. I think one of the things that struck me listening to the discussion and also picking up on some of the comments and questions on Slido as well was the sort of complexity and diversity of this. So sometimes we talk about all economic inactivities up, but actually the variations by age, by demographic, by region, by all kinds of other things that we've talked about, and by different motivations as well. You know, even within that older age group that we talk about, as Catherine was saying from her focus groups, you know, some people have decided to retire early and they've got the money to do that, and that's what they want to do, and then others less so. So I think that's something that I think is really important for us to bear in mind in both policy and practice. I think there is more to do to understand the nature of the challenge, the nature of the situation. I'm struck that whilst there's all those differences going on and all those variations, as Naomi said earlier on, the UK is pretty unique in seeing this exodus, particularly in those older age groups. Some of that perhaps is down to those pension freedoms, and if people have got enough, then that's kind of their choice. But I think there's more going on there. So lots to do, both to understand the challenge more fully, and we'll be doing more work on that, as you might imagine, but also to look at what's going on to help change some of these things. So some of the projects that we talked about, some of the ideas we talked about, they are being trialled across the country. So if there are really interesting things going on, please do let us know. And we, like I'm sure many people on this webinar, will be feeding into the DWP, into their review that they're doing at the moment. But I think critically, this isn't just about the DWP or central government. This is about the Welsh Government, Scottish Government, Northern Ireland Executive. Richard mentioned their plans for UK Shared Prosperity Fund, and local government, and critically employers as well. So if employers want to fill all those vacancies, then they need to go and find people, and they need to think about how they're structuring jobs so that they appeal to people who want to come and work for them as well. So lots going on. We'll be doing lots more work on this. This is a topic we will return to. But in the meantime, I'd like to thank Akila for excellent chairing there. All of the speakers for their really great insights into different aspects of this issue, and also the 200 or so of you who've dialed in, and all those great questions on the Slido as well. So thank you very much for joining us, and have a great rest of the day, and I hope you have a lovely Christmas break as well. Thanks everybody.